piece that I published this morning about Ulysses S. Grant. And just, you know, kind of follow along with me here. Prior to 1965, from the founding of our republic until 1965, with the exception of this very, very brief period of time of just a little more than a decade right after the Civil War, with the exception of that, we were never a multiracial democracy prior to 1965. People of color, specifically, and including and women as well, prior to 1920, were not allowed to vote. It was basically only white men up until 1920, and then only white people until 1965. And there was this little window from the end of the Civil War in 1865, and Andrew Johnson, who was very opposed to the idea of black people voting, nonetheless, he was a Southern slave owner. He was Lincoln's vice president, and he became president when Lincoln was assassinated. Nonetheless, he was president while this was happening during Reconstruction. But then he was followed by Ulysses S. Grant, who was elected in the election of 1868. And Grant and became president on March 4th of 1869. Grant had been a general in Lincoln's army. He helped win the Civil War. And he gave this speech that I think is really worth revisiting, which is why I wrote about it today at HartmannReport.com. Keep in mind, this speech he gave just, I don't know, 13, 14 months before he left office. It was the end of his term. It was also just a few months after this, we saw the end of multiracial democracy in the United States with the Hayes-Tilden so-called compromise, where the Republicans and Democrats got together and basically decided to stab African Americans in the back, and, you know, which led to legal apartheid. It led to Jim Crow and legal apartheid, and ultimately even to the Plessy decision. So Grant goes back to Iowa. This is on September 29th, 1875. He goes to Iowa to visit a group of veterans called the Army of the Tennessee. Now, these were Union soldiers who had fought in Tennessee. And this is in Des Moines, Iowa. And he gives this speech. He starts out, he says, "It always affords me so much gratification to meet my old comrades in arms of 10 to 14 years ago," which kind of puts it into, whoa, you know, this is recent. "And to live over again the trials and hardships of those days, hardships imposed for the preservation and perpetuation of our free institutions. We believed then and believe now that we have had a government worth fighting for and, if need be, dying for." And then he goes on to say, you know, "But we are not prepared to apologize for the part we took in the great struggle, and it is to be hoped that like trials will never befall our country." And he's talking about this enemy of American democracy. He says, "We must begin by guarding against every enemy threatening the perpetuity of these free Republican institutions." And the enemy that he specifically identified was ignorant racists and fundamentalist religious zealots. And this is where this is absolutely brilliant. He said, "If we are to have another contest in the near future of our national existence, I predict that the dividing line will not be Mason and Dixon's, but between patriotism and intelligence on the one side and superstition, ambition, and ignorance on the other." He said, "Leave the matter of religion to the family circle, the church, and the private schools supported entirely by private contributions. Keep the church and state forever separate. With these safeguards, I believe the battles which created the Army of the Tennessee will not have been fought in vain." In other words, this was this ignorance and racism and bigotry and religion brought us the Civil War, says President Grant. And so now we are back to, are we going to be a multiracial democracy? And you've got these so-called conservatives on the Supreme Court. I think that they're white supremacists who are saying, you know, it's okay if states pass laws that make it much, much more difficult for people of color to vote. That's fine, no problem. We're okay with that. And here we are again. It's like this reincarnation. You got 17 states now that have passed 28 voter suppression laws.